Alexander the Great is one of the most iconic figures in history. A warrior king whose bravado and brilliant tactics forged an empire that stretched from Greece to the ends of the world by the age of just 32. Yet much of this success is owed to the soldiers of his army, and in particular the Macedonian riders who delivered his signature hammer and anvil strikes. Most of the time, we hear of these elite Companion Cavalry only as they thunder into battle. However, such a limited window into their role does them a disservice. Today, let us dive deeper into the history of the Companion Cavalry. A big thanks to the Great Courses Plus for sponsoring this video. They offer subscription-based on-demand lecture videos put together by top professors from renowned universities and specialists from places like National Geographic and the Smithsonian. You get unlimited access to a huge library of over 11,000 videos, which cover topics from history to science, math, and literature, with new content being added every month. Their history playlist is quite expansive, with a huge 48-part series called The Other Side of History on daily life in the past. To enrich our own content, definitely check out Lecture 13 on being a Greek soldier and sailor. For me, I found it best to download the app on my phone. This allows me to swap from video to audio mode so I can listen to the series as a podcast while going about my daily activities. Right now, the Great Courses Plus is offering a free trial, which you can start by clicking the link in the description below or visiting thegreatcoursesplus.com/Invicta. I highly recommend that you take a look at what they have to offer and dive into the material you are most interested in. Our story begins with the early history of Macedon. Geographically speaking, it is an area with two distinct regions. The fertile lowland plains fed by three principal rivers, and the rugged highlands covered by vast forested mountains. These conditions led to the development of many small, independent communities with different languages, cultures, and religious traditions. Each tribal group organized locally and crowned their own kings. The lowlands were perhaps the easiest to tame, and it is here that the seed for the Macedonian kingdom would be planted. Legends tell of how the central Macedonian people began their ascent during the early Archaic period, under the leadership of the Argead dynasty, whose kings traced their lineage to Argos. Unfortunately, little can be said of their exploits during these murky years. It's only around the mid-6th century BC that things come into focus, with the reign of Amyntas I. When we pick up the narrative at this point, it appears that Macedon was already an established kingdom tucked into the central lowlands. For centuries, its rulers had governed over local affairs, establishing diplomatic, trade, and military relations with the tribes and city-states around them. However, the status quo would be disturbed by the arrival of the Persians. In 513 BC, the invaders launched significant military operations in the area against the Thracians and Scythians, forging the province of Scudra in the process. While Macedon was initially spared this conquest, after giving earth and water, it would be fully subjugated 2 decades later in the aftermath of the Ionian Revolt. Shortly thereafter, the Greco Persian Wars broke out in the early 5th century BC. During these conflicts, the Macedonians would find themselves aligned with the Achaemenids, fighting primarily as mounted elites, such as at the Battle of Platae. Yet while the Macedonians provided men, food, and material for the war effort, they were not entirely loyal. King Alexander I, for example, is said to have also sent the Greek allies supplies and information. When the Persians attempted a land retreat at the end of the wars through the Balkans, it was Macedon which descended upon and destroyed their column on the march. This victory allowed Alexander I to now rule over an independent kingdom. His reign proved transformative as he expanded the borders of the realm, began reforms to model his court after Athens, and imported many Greek practices. In response, the southern city-states granted him the title of Friend of the Greeks and allowed the monarch to actually participate in the exclusive Olympic Games. When Greek turned on Greek during the Peloponnesian War, Macedon profited greatly by selling raw materials to both sides whilst avoiding the worst of the bloodshed. King Archelaus I made the most of this advantageous position by implementing many internal reforms, with an eye on bolstering his military standing. This involved building new roads and strongholds, as well as reforming the infantry and cavalry. He also established a new capital at Pella, where the king invited some of the most famous Greek poets and artists to his court. Yet the kingdom was not without its own struggles, involving assassinations, revolts, and invasions. For example, Archelaus would be murdered on a hunt by one of his companions, which set off a chain of short-lived rulers. Some progress was made by kings like Amyntas III, but by and large Macedonia would spend most of the 4th century BC adrift in a sea of turmoil, beset by enemies on all sides. It's into this time of crisis that Philip II would be born. During his youth, the young Macedonian heir had been held as a political hostage, first by the Illyrians, then by the Thebans. He would learn much from his captives. In Thebes, for instance, Philip grew close to the commanders Epaminondas, Parmenas, and Pelopidas, who introduced him to the latest developments in Greek political and military matters. The ideas of deploying professional military forces like the Sacred Band and using decisive mounted assaults to break numerically superior opponents would prove quite influential. His mind would have been abuzz with possibilities. When Philip returned home in 364 BC, his brother Perdiccas III gave him a portion of territory to govern. It appears that this early opportunity may have allowed Philip to begin experimenting with some of his ideas. However, this testing phase would be short-lived when the crown was suddenly thrust upon Macedon's heir following a disastrous Illyrian campaign which killed Perdiccas and much of his army. The realm was now crippled, easy prey, and on the verge of collapse. Yet the 23-year-old ruler was up to the challenge. Philip immediately instituted a bold plan of reform to raise his country from a backwater territory to a first-rate power. This primarily involved modernizing the military based on what he had learned while abroad. No longer would Macedonians fight as a mere levy or rabble, but as a paid professional force. To do so, reforms to recruitment were implemented to swell the ranks of the infantry and cavalry. Soldiers now drew their salary from the crown, wore uniforms, and pledged oaths to the king, which increased their overall unity. The actual composition of the armed forces also changed with the innovation of new sarissa pikemen, who carried smaller shields but much longer spears than their hoplite counterparts. By their side would be additional infantry, cavalry, and skirmishing elements that worked together in a novel combined arms doctrine. At the head of this newly built juggernaut would be the king and his reformed Companion Cavalry. Let us now take a closer look at this leading unit, which was poised to take the ancient world by storm. We are told that at the beginning of Philip's reign, there were 600 Companion Cavalry. These had not materialized out of thin air. Rather, they originated as the heteroi, or those near the king. This group represented an important social function in the Macedonian culture, where close personal relations bound a ruler to his subjects. Aristocrats within this inner circle regularly feasted with the ruler in symposia, advised him on matters of state or military tactics, and accompanied him into battle as a bodyguard. They were the backbone of the king's power. It seems that Alexander I had been the first to select a subset of these to mount up as horsemen, in a similar manner to the Achaemenid system of kinsmen. When Philip came to power, he called upon his own nobles from across Macedon to answer the call to arms. They responded by organizing regionally into squadrons from places like Platae, Amphipolis, Apollonia, and Themos, before uniting with the crown at the capital of Pella. These troopers were heavy cavalrymen. Let us now review their equipment. The most important item on the list would be their steed. These were of excellent quality. The favorable climate and terrain of Macedon produced horses of hearty stock, with thick bones, strong muscles, and fine heads. Their abilities were further enhanced by a long tradition of breeding and training. The royal stables were particularly renowned for their specimens, which won several riding and chariot races at the Olympic Games. Companions typically owned their horses and were likely rich enough to even have their own stables and employ their own attendants. Those who were of lesser means, however, would be granted money from the crown upon enrollment in the ranks, so as to properly equip themselves. The horse's back would be covered in a simple cloth saddle for comfort of both man and horse. Remember that the adoption of the stirrup was still centuries away. Riders would thus be expected to grip the horse with their thighs and use training to minimize their bounce. A horse might also be adorned with additional decorative elements such as animal pelts from lions or leopards, though this was likely reserved for royalty. Most Macedonian cavalrymen wore a simple tunic with a pair of standard open-toed army boots. Companions likely stood out a bit more than this, owing to their high status. We know, for instance, that some wealthy members sported shoes with gold detailing and later carried purple cloaks captured from the Persians or styled in the Eastern manner. On a more practical level, though, the companions stood out as heavy troops who were issued a linothorax cuirass for extra protection, though this might be replaced with a muscled bronze cuirass. Helmets were also added. Early on, these would have been in the Phrygian style, common to the region, but would later be replaced by the superior Boeotian model. Such helmets were made of a single piece, hammered over a mold, which greatly increased their strength. Meanwhile, their high dome helped cushion and deflect blows from above, while providing a sun and missile screen for the wearer, who maintained excellent vision and hearing. Crests might be added for command roles. Beyond this, speed would be the rider's only defense, as no shields were carried. No explicit reason for this is given by our sources, but it seems that this was a consequence of their choice of weaponry. The primary offensive tool for a companion was a 3 to 4 meter long Xiphston lance. The shaft was made from cornel wood, prized for its elasticity and hardness, while both ends were tipped by an iron spear head. The spear could be used one-handed for stabbing or two-handed as a lance. An additional strap helped keep the weapon under control while riding or in combat. As a backup, a soldier would either use the dual-edged Xiphos sword or the curved, front-weighted kopis. When it comes to training, the Companion Cavalry was whipped into shape by Philip along with the rest of the army. This was achieved through constant exercise and drills, often in full gear with a heavy focus on discipline. Frequent reviews were held to ensure all met the king's standards. Any insubordination was not tolerated and would be met with heavy punishment. For example, we are told of how a man who abandoned a march to drop into an inn was flogged, while another was executed for removing his kit whilst ordered to remain under arms. Yet it wasn't all stick and no carrot. Positive reinforcement was also employed through the introduction of prizes, awards, and promotions for good deeds. These helped encourage healthy competition within the ranks, which drove many to pull off daring feats in battle in the hopes of winning rewards from their commanders. In addition to these army-wide practices, the companions would have had more specific training as riders. Much of this involved learning to maintain control and balance on a horse under various conditions. For most Greek cavalry, this meant riding over rough ground, launching a few javelins and closing the distance at a moderate speed. However, the companions were different. They were true shock cavalry who skipped over the ranged foreplay and charged straight into combat at full speed. Such an attack would have been extremely dangerous in an era before stirrups and the couched lance. Companions, therefore, would have trained exhaustingly to master the maneuver. Unfortunately, the secrets to their success are lost to the ages. In battle, the Companion Cavalry were used to devastating effect by King Philip. Their preferred tactic was that of the hammer and anvil. This combined arms approach involved the frontline pikemen pinning the enemy in place, while the cavalry fell upon their flank or rear. The assault was typically carried out in a wedge formation. This leveraged the herd mentality of the horses to form a highly flexible unit that could move nimbly across the battlefield, exploiting gaps in enemy lines or punching holes through them. They would first prove their worth in the early campaigns of Philip. War was first waged against the threats in his immediate vicinity. A resurgent Macedon now pushed back the Paeonians, Thracians, and Athenians before confronting the Illyrians, who had killed their king just a few years earlier. At the Battle of Aragon Valley, the Macedonian cavalry got their revenge by crushing an Illyrian flank, which resulted in a decisive victory. Next, Philip drove south, involving himself in the affairs of Thessaly in the 350s BC, and ultimately coming to blows with the Phocians. At the Battle of Crocus Field, the companions once again helped crack the enemy ranks with a brutal hammer and anvil that saw 6,000 of the foe killed and another 3,000 captured. Philip then used his army to consolidate the lands to the north before returning his attention to Greece. This campaign climaxed at the pivotal Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Traditional narratives hypothesize that it is here a young Prince Alexander led the Companion Cavalry to defeat the sacred band of Thebes. However, more recent scholarship has questioned the role of cavalry and posited that the move was achieved by a group of infantry. Regardless, the battle ended with a Macedonian victory, which placed Philip at the head of the Corinthian League. The king was now in control of a huge territory with enormous resources at his disposal. These would be turned against the great enemy of the East, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Clearly, Philip believed the companions would play a pivotal role in the days ahead and tripled their strength from a mere 600 troopers to a total of 1,800. However, before he could launch this ambitious campaign, the king of Macedon was murdered by an assassin in 336 BC. His 20-year-old son, Alexander, would now ascend to the throne and be the one to lead the charge against the Persians. The Companion Cavalry would be the tip of that spear. The unexpected death of Philip shook the Aegean world and caused many to throw off the Macedonian yoke. Thebes, Athens, Thessaly, and the northern tribes all threatened to rise in revolt. However, the new king would meet the crisis head-on with bold, decisive action. Alexander moved first to eliminate rivals to the throne, before calling up his army and riding south. The Macedonians outmaneuvered the Thessalian army, which had arisen to stop them, prompting their surrender. Next, he rode to Corinth and humbled the Greeks with the speed and force of his advance. The southern flank was secure for now. The Macedonians then rode north to defeat the Thracians, Getae, and Illyrians in a whirlwind campaign. The Companions again proved their worth by applying shock tactics to win several victories with few losses. Yet while these actions pacified the north, the southern cities of Thebes and Athens rose up once more. Alexander descended upon them with a vengeful fury, completely razing the city of seven gates and selling the survivors into slavery. The brutal destruction of Thebes cowed the remaining Greeks who laid down their arms. Alexander had finally consolidated his power. Now, the heir of Philip could finally pick up where his father had left off and turn his attention to Persia. Thus, in 334 BC, Alexander led a coalition force of some 35,000 soldiers and over 150 ships across the Hellespont. We are told by Diodorus Siculus that 1,800 Companion Cavalry made the crossing under the command of Philotas, son of Parmenion, while 1,500 of their brethren remained behind under the command of Antipater to secure the home front. The advanced group was divided into 8 squadrons, or illi, each commanded by an illarch. 7 of the units numbered 200 strong, while the 8th, the Royal Squadron, was maintained at a double strength of 400. This leading element, the Isle Basilic, was commanded by Black Clytus, son of Dropidas, and staffed by the most trusted and able members of the Macedonian cavalry. It was their duty to protect the king in battle at all costs. They would do so on multiple occasions throughout Alexander's campaigns. For example, at the Battle of Granicus, it was the Companions who charged across the river without hesitation to flank the Persians. They fought gallantly in a furious clash of arms. At one point, Alexander himself was struck and nearly killed were it not for the quick action of Commander Clytus, who dismembered his Persian assailant. Their brave distraction allowed the main body of the infantry to advance, which soon led to an enemy rout. While Macedonian losses were light, these fell disproportionately on the Companions, who lost 25 of their comrades. In their honor, Alexander would order the erection of brazen statues at Dium. A year and a half later, when the Macedonians next faced the entrenched Persian army at Issus, it was the Companions who charged first across the river under heavy fire. This spearhead pierced the enemy right before twisting itself inwards, gutting the foe and striking for its heart. We are told that Alexander cut his way to within a spear's throw of King Darius, who was now seized with panic and fled. Though the Achaemenid ruler's retreat may have saved his life, but ultimately doomed his army, which fell into a rout as news spread. In the aftermath, the Macedonians would seize not just the Persian camp, but also their western domains from the Levant all the way to Egypt. Yet Alexander was not sated with these conquests, and in 331 BC drove eastward into Mesopotamia, where he would be met once more by King Darius at the Battle of Gaugamela. Here, Alexander adopted an echeloned formation and pushed right to draw the enemy away from prepared ground and overextend their flank. A fierce cavalry fight developed on the wing, which drew support from the center. At the opportune moment, with the Persian chariot wave repulsed and their infantry committed, Alexander reformed his companions into a massive wedge for an attack. His royal isle led the charge from the front, with supporting infantry and skirmishers following in their wake. As at Issus, this spearhead was plunged directly into the enemy center, seeking the Achaemenid king. Persian kinsmen heavy cavalry, apple-bearers, and skirmishers attempted a defense, but none could withstand the pressure as the eastern ranks melted away. Once again, Darius fled the field. Alexander and his companions initially gave pursuit, but were apparently called back to rescue the beleaguered Macedonian left. As the Macedonians returned, they slammed into a mass of fleeing Persians, which resulted in some of the hardest-fought cavalry action of the day. Some 60 companions fell, while Hephaestion and several commanders were wounded. Soon, however, the enemy right completely dissolved into a rout. The battle was over. Victory opened the road to Mesopotamia as Darius fled further east. In short order, Alexander took the great cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. The troops were richly rewarded with praise, spoils, and rest. In addition, their ranks were replenished by reinforcements from Macedon. This was a great boon to the companions, who had suffered quite heavy losses as the king's shock troopers. Now, their numbers exceeded those at the start of the campaign. To deal with this expansion, it seems that the Iliae were subdivided into 2 lokoi, each of which was commanded by a lokargos, chosen from amongst the unit by merit. These rejuvenated forces would prove invaluable in the months ahead, as Alexander set off in pursuit of Darius. However, Alexander would again be denied his prize when the Achaemenid king was betrayed and killed by the Bactrian satrap Bessus. Undeterred, the Macedonians now set off to defeat the usurper, a campaign which would unfurl into a grand tour of Central Asia. Along the way, we are told that Alexander increasingly adopted Eastern traditions, much to the displeasure of his countrymen. This caused significant friction within the Macedonian high command and even spawned assassination plots. Philotas, son of Parmenion, supreme commander of the Companion Cavalry, was executed on suspicion of his involvement. A wary Alexander then divided this powerful position into 2 hipparchies, each of which commanded just 4 of the Iliae. Yet, as the nature of the campaign continued to change, there would be further reorganizations of the army. The Companion Cavalry, for instance, was swelled by new reinforcements and units of the Macedonian light cavalry, such that their numbers rose to an estimated 3,600 men. These were then divided into approximately 8 hipparchies, whose commanders were now chosen by merit and trustworthiness rather than noble birth. These more flexible squadrons were often detached from the main body for independent action. However, they would famously regroup during the Indian campaign to fight the Battle of Hydaspes in 326 BC. Here, the companions once more led the advance across a river and took up position on the right flank. In a lightning strike, they charged the unformed Indian cavalry in a devastating blow. Enemy reinforcements pulled from the other side of the field attempted to salvage the situation, but were also cut to pieces by Macedonians emerging from the rear. Soon, the infantry and elephants too became involved, as the battlefield devolved into one of the bloodiest actions of Alexander's campaigns. Eventually, however, the companions broke through and completed an encirclement of the enemy army. The hammer and anvil had once more proved the key to victory. Alexander wished to continue fighting to the ends of the world, but his battered army refused to march any further upon reaching the Hyphasis River. Casualties for the Indian campaigns are hardly ever given, but they must have been heavy from battle, guerrilla fighting, and especially disease. It seems that the companions were particularly impacted, as their 8 hipparchies were reduced to just 4 hipparchies. The ill-fated march through the Gedrosian desert upon leaving India must have further compounded these losses. By the time the Macedonians returned to Persepolis in 324 BC, they were in a sorry shape. In response, Alexander sought to infuse them with renewed energy. This was done by adding new Eastern forces to his ranks. For instance, 15,000 Persians were trained to fight in the phalanx, and the companions were now joined by Oriental riders given Macedonian spears. However, to placate the grumbling from his countrymen, a new fifth hipparchy was formed with an exclusively Macedonian roster, save for a few notable Iranians. It was to be the most distinguished unit, now referred to as a Kiliarchy, and commanded by none other than Hephaestion. Some veterans, however, had had enough and mutinied once more at Opis. Eventually, the situation was resolved, and many Macedonians were dismissed or discharged. Of those who went home with Craterus, we are told by Diodorus that there were some 1,500 cavalry, most of which we can reasonably assume must have been companions. Soon, Alexander would begin preparations for new ambitious campaigns. However, his dreams would be cut short when he fell ill and died unexpectedly in 323 BC at the age of just 32. According to ancient sources, when Alexander's companions asked him on his deathbed to whom he left the kingdom, he reportedly answered, "To the strongest." Indeed, Macedonian unity would now collapse as the vast realm was split between successors who vied for control of the empire. In these matters, individuals who had previously served as officers of the infantry and cavalry were now elevated to the status of kings. History, however, is less clear about what happened to specific units, such as the Companion Cavalry, which become lost in the swirl of the period. Yet, while the original force might have faded away, its memory would not, as many now sought to emulate the success of this heavy cavalry force which conquered the world with its hammer and anvil tactics. We hope you've appreciated this deep dive into the history of the Companion Cavalry. A huge thanks is owed to our supporters on Patreon and the many talented researchers, writers, and artists who made this video possible. A special thanks is owed to our friend from the channel, Duratus, who did the bulk of the heavy lifting for the script. Definitely check out his channel for more animated history on the Macedonians. And as always, let us know what units of history you want to see covered next. Thanks for watching.